Everyone, we're very happy to have you here. My name is Lisa Carenti, and I'm the Executive Vice President for the Center for Family and Human Rights. We are the organizer and one of the co-sponsors for today's event. We're very grateful to our other two co-sponsors, the United States Mission to the UN and the Heritage Foundation. Before moving to our panel presenters, I'd like to first recognize the distinguished representative from the U.S. Mission, Mr. Jonathan Schreier, to deliver opening remarks. Mr. Schreier is the U.S. Deputy Representative to ECOSOC. We welcome you here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. It's an honor to address this important gathering today on the critical issue of protecting women and families from the impact of gender ideology, which undermines the rights and protections that generations of women have fought for. The United States is steadfast in its commitment to defending the inherent rights of women and girls, ensuring their equality, safety, and opportunities in all aspects of life. As President Trump stated in his proclamation to celebrate Women's History Month, the administration will safeguard the great American values of family, truth, well-being, and freedom. We are especially committed to defending these rights, particularly in spaces where women have historically been excluded or marginalized. As affirmed in President Trump's executive orders, the United States opposes policies that seek to erase the category of sex and the unique characteristics that define women as female and men as male. Our focus is clear: preserving the integrity of women's spaces from our schools to our sports, and ensuring that biological males do not infringe upon the rights of women and girls. Just as we have taken steps to ensure men do not participate in women's sports, we must respect the fundamental rights of women and safeguard their opportunities, including by standing up against the promotion of gender ideology in educational settings. At the United Nations, the United States continues to advocate for women's empowerment, while firmly opposing attempts to redefine womanhood in ways that undermine the real and meaningful progress women have made. We are committed to promoting policies that support women and families in a way that recognizes and celebrates the biological and social differences that make us who we are. In New York, we have engaged in tough negotiations on a wide range of UN resolutions, fighting against gender ideology and calling votes if necessary to advance President Trump's America First foreign policy. Let us reaffirm our shared responsibilities to protect the most vulnerable among us. The United States remains committed to defending women, children, and families from ideological extremism and ensuring that the rights of women and girls are safeguarded for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and we're very grateful to the United States for their leadership on the issue. I make this opening remark on behalf of my organization, CFAM. We're especially grateful to President Trump for his executive action to protect women and children from gender ideology on the first day of his administration. No doubt, years from now, we will look back to this time as a pivotal moment when we saved our children from being exploited by a gender ideology craze that had the potential to harm millions around the world. When the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action was adopted 30 years ago, member states insisted that it include a statement saying that it did not introduce any new definitions of gender beyond its traditional understanding. Yet, as activists warned then, gender terminology has opened the door to gender ideology. Sadly, this has often come at the expense of women and girls and exposed them to various forms of harm, such as a contagion of gender confusion among adolescent girls and the loss of female-only spaces and activities. Over the past decade, UN Women, the agency tasked with promoting women's equality, has been at the forefront of promoting the concept of gender as a mere social construct. At the Gender Equality Forum only 3 years ago, UN Women partnered with donor countries to argue that gender ideology was essential to the implementation of the Beijing Agenda. To be clear, President Trump's executive orders are not extreme. Quite the opposite. They represent a course correction, bringing the U.S. more in line with other Western countries that have also backed away from promoting youth gender transitions and rejected the discredited guidelines written by activists and founded on flawed science. Gender ideology is controversial politically and scientifically. It has been repeatedly rejected by the General Assembly and is a matter of dispute between UN human rights experts. The current rapporteur on violence against women, Reem Al-Salem, has also recognized that the concept of gender has become a threat to protecting women. By eliminating the real biological differences between men and women, she said, the concept of gender makes women invisible, it threatens the integrity of women-only spaces, and it threatens the mental and physical health of women. As we will hear in today's event, those harmed most by gender ideology are girls. Young girls anxious in the face of real discrimination and objectification in contemporary society are pushed into thinking that the unique changes that their bodies undergo in puberty are a mistake. Today's panelists will offer personal testimonies and social and legal policy evidence, which is fueling a global movement to correct much-needed policy mistakes. We'll move to our panel presentation. I'd like to thank our panelists for being here. Our first panelist is J.W. Richards. Dr. Richards is director of the Richard and Helen DeVoe Center for Life, Religion, and Family, and William E. Simon Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. He is the author of more than a dozen books and the creator and executive producer of several documentaries. His work has been widely published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Richards.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you and to be with this panel. So I'm the sort of policy guy that works on this stuff. So I want to just give you a few minutes of background. Any American in the room is going to know this stuff, but it might be a bit of whiplash for you to realize that in the United States for the previous 4 years, we were effectively exporting gender ideology as a part of our foreign policy, and in fact, as part of our foreign aid, while simultaneously people opposed to gender ideology in country were working in individual states to try to push back against this stuff with remarkable success. And so that's mostly what those of us working in this issue have been doing for the last 4 years. So as already sort of implicitly stated, the only thing you basically need to understand about gender ideology is this. So we're not talking about the individuals who struggle with their personal identities or struggle with their sex bodies. We're talking about an ideology that replaces sex as an observable reality in the world that describes human beings. It replaces it. It might sound radical, with two different ideas. Gender identity, which is an internal sense of gender, so in other words, a purely immaterial, subjective state of mind detached from the body, and a social construct called sex assigned at birth. That's it in its essence. And if you understand that, you can understand why any society that tries to recognize the intrinsic equality of men and women and their intrinsic differences and natural differences, you could see why this ideology would be a threat to that. If you think I'm exaggerating, I just want to show you this is the most popular teaching tool for young American kids in the United States of America today. You can Google it. This is called the Gender Unicorn. It's a catechetical aid for teaching gender ideology to small kids, just at the sort of beginnings of literacy. We can spend 20 minutes on it, but we won't do that. Here's the key thing I want you to understand. is that it's designed to dissolve the category of male and female, boy and girl, in the minds of, say, a 5 or 6-year-old who's still forming these categories, and to replace it with this sort of androgynous self that has these different aspects. So this person can have a gender identity, which turns out is infinitely variable, a gender expression, a sort of attraction and orientation, so who you're physically and emotionally attracted to. And then, rather than sex, you get sex assigned at birth. So even in a diagram this detailed, sex as an observed category is gone. That's the point. That's the ideology. It's precisely why it's so radical. It's precisely why the campaign to push this upon the civilizations of the world is doomed to failure, because it's fundamentally at odds with reality. The question is how many people get hurt in the meantime. So both internationally and in the United States for the last decade and a half, a particular medical protocol has been popularized, called the Dutch protocol, but the way we Americans practice it is much more flexible and liberal and unrestricted. And it's essentially an attempt to take someone, and children in particular, who have an internal sense of gender that's contrary or incongruent with their sex assigned at birth, and rather than helping them to adjust their minds and their perceptions to their bodily reality, to change the bodysuit that is a mere ephemera of who they are, and to transform that with drugs and surgery and social conventions to conform to the gender identity. And so these are the steps: social transition, change names and pronouns, followed by puberty blockers if a child is young enough to freeze them before they go through natural puberty, followed by cross-sex hormones to alter the sort of presentation of their secondary sex characteristics, followed by so-called gender-affirming surgery. And so I could tell you 3 or 4 years ago in policy work, just persuading members of Congress that this was a real thing that was happening, that was actually the job. Just absolutely convincing them that it was real. Once that was apparent, we sort of knew what to do. So let's focus on the really, frankly, the most ghoulish parts of this ideology. First, the way in which the ideology pits parents against their children, in particular in US schools around the country, including in red states. Schools would often have secret social transition programs. So if a child comes to school and they were referring to her as a girl and she says she's a boy, the school kicks in, right? And so the social transition, a psychosocial intervention happens at school and almost always behind parents' backs. So laws that simply prohibit the secret social transitioning of kids started in Florida and has now found its way around the country. Over half of US states, just in the last 4 years, have passed laws restricting the application of this gender medicine, frankly, this gender quackery on children. So that's half the US states have done that. A final sort of initiative that's just been happening in the last couple of years, it was an effort to simply define what male and female are. So for our entire republic's history, it never occurred to anyone to define what sex was and what males and females were. If you read Title IX, the federal law prohibiting sex discrimination in federally funded contexts from 1972, it's designed to prevent sex discrimination. It doesn't define what sex is. No state had a definition of what a male and a female are. And so that's because it hadn't been contested, right? Once it's contested, you need a definition. And so states in the last couple of years have been doing very, very careful work to specify, okay, what biologically is a male, what biologically is a female, and how can we, in a non-arbitrary way, make that distinction. I won't go into the details, although this is my particular academic interest, but you can look it up. But the main thing to know about sex is it's not, the definition of it doesn't have to do with chromosomes or complicated things. It has to do with what you already knew: reproduction. Sexual reproduction is about the fusion of two differently sized gametes and the reproductive systems that correspond to that. It's exactly two gametes. Now, some people have disorders of sexual development in which this doesn't fully come to fruition, but there's no third gamete. There's no transition gamete. That's why sex is binary. Now, what none of us expected was a complete change of fortune in which we'd been working in the States. And then President Trump was elected, and as was mentioned a few minutes ago, one of the first things he did is sign 4 executive orders dealing with the definition of male and female, private sports, the gender medicine against children, and the indoctrination of gender ideology in K through 12 education. Now this is, for someone working on this for years, this is sort of Christmas multiple days in a row, I don't know what to call it, to see actual executive orders that get this right. So we're suddenly in a new moment in which both domestically and in terms of our foreign policy, it's a new day. The good news is that. The bad news is that the fight is still a long way from being won, because it, of course, being propagated through international organizations. And so a number of us, a number of organizations, mainly in the United States, recently formed a new coalition called the Coalition Against Gender Ideology. And if your organization is interested in this and wants to sign on, you can check out the information. And I've got the URL here. It's coalitionagainstgenderideology.org. And so that will be the next stage of this battle. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jay. Maria Poet is a 25-year-old writer and public speaker. She spent half of her life identifying and then living as transgender before realizing that her attempt to escape womanhood caused more problems than it solved. She now works to provide insights from her personal experience to parents, young people, mental health professionals, and to policymakers more broadly. Thank you for being with us today, Maya.
Oh, can you? Yeah. Okay. Oops. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Maya Poet. I'm 25 years old, and I'm a detransitioner. I'm so honored to speak before you all today. Even 1.5 years ago, when I was still trans, I could never have imagined that the trans train would lead me to this particular destination. My gender journey began with the iPad I got for my 12th birthday. At the age of 12 in 2012, after months of online research, I came out to my parents as trans. My parents refused to affirm the identity. Nonetheless, I was already committed to the idea that a gender transition would be my only path to happiness, and I began to plan my future as a man. I began binding my breasts in order to prevent their continued development. By 18, I went off to college, began my social transition, and bought a chest binder that was marketed as 100% safe. But I began to experience pain in my ribs and sought advice from a doctor on my university campus. Instead of telling me to stop binding my breasts, she encouraged me to pursue breast removal as a remedy for the pain and discomfort caused by binding. She referred me to a gender clinic. I didn't pursue it, not for a lack of wanting, but because I knew my parents wouldn't allow it. By 19, my parents noticed how persistent I was in my transgender identity, and they sent me to Israel for a study abroad. They had hoped that extracting me from a woke, affirmation-only environment and placing me into the highly traditional conservative Middle East would cause me to quit my gender transition. Instead, I did the opposite. This was a new opportunity for me to live as a man within Orthodox Jewish and Palestinian Muslim societies, as well as the broader secular Israeli society. I was an Israeli-Palestinian peace activist with a rich social life where nearly everyone knew me as a man. Only a select few people knew my secret, that I was actually a woman. Though I had no access to the healthcare system, and I spent years pursuing Israeli citizenship in order to medicalize far away from my non-affirming parents, I still managed to dabble in cross-sex hormone use. Even though I didn't have a prescription from a doctor, my other trans friends did. They were more than happy to give me some of their supply. In May of 2021, I lived through my first war in Israel, or as the locals call it, a military operation. I found myself running back and forth to bomb shelters, and in between sirens, I spent hours on social media engaging in fruitless debates with my terrorist-supporting leftist American friends back home. So I became increasingly disillusioned with the left, and the algorithms began to shift the content I was seeing. I suddenly found myself in right-wing internet spaces. As soon as I realized that I wasn't actually trapped in the wrong body and that the last half of my life had been a lie, I was now uniquely aware of the fact that I was trapped in my gender transition. The stakes of quitting were far too high. I had already woven a complex web as a man in sectors of society where men and women can't even shake hands. I was actively endangering myself every single day by transitioning, especially in the Middle East, but revealing my real sex would have endangered me far more, so I continued my transition, even when I no longer believed in what I was doing. It was not until I woke up to a blaring siren at 8 in the morning on October 7th, 2023, and didn't have time to squeeze myself into a breast binder because I had to run to a bomb shelter that I realized that there's no more point in continuing to live this lie. Why was I obsessing over my gender troubles when death was staring me right in the face? Turns out there's bigger fish to fry when you live in a war zone. I am here to explore the question of what happens when you tell a trans-identified kid no. What happens when an ideologically captured young person has no conceivable medical pathway until at least 18? Since this is the world we're trying to create, let's explore how it might look in practice. First, it's important to state the obvious. Social transition of prepubertal kids only happens due to the promise that puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones will be available to obscure the child's sex forever. If these treatment bans are upheld everywhere, we will inevitably have a cohort of prepubertal, socially transitioned children who will approach puberty and be denied the broken life raft that they have been promised since before they learned to tie their shoes. The only options available for them in this social climate will be interventions like breast binding and genital tucking, which use tissue-compressing garments that can easily be bought on Amazon or at Target, but nonetheless cause permanent bodily damage, especially when they are used by children whose bodies are still developing. From the moment these girls begin to grow breasts, they will crush them through binding. I bound my breasts in different ways for nearly a decade, and I've been severely damaged by this process. My breasts and ribcage are permanently disfigured. I cannot take deep breaths without pain. It hurts to lie down on my sides. I have pain in my ribs, and I have posture issues. I'm 25. Quitting binding didn't reverse this damage, and all of it has only compounded the psychological distress that as a 12-year-old drove me to adopt a trans identity in the first place. Now, these harms are often overlooked because, frankly, kids like me are the lucky ones. Many feel that transition didn't damage our bodies enough in order for our experiences to count. My transition still robbed me of 12 years, or roughly half of my life. But it did not fundamentally ruin my endocrine system or rob me of my breasts. I am lucky in that sense, but I was still damaged in mind and in body by gender ideology. But this is not about me. This is about all the kids who are already facing harms that are routinely overlooked, time and time again. The harms of gender ideology do not actually begin in a doctor's office. They begin from the moment that a child adopts the belief that they were born in the wrong body. Each subsequent psychosocial, physical, medical, and surgical intervention only carries the risk for more potential, more irreversible harms, which compound over time. When we choose to ignore how harmful social transition is and how easy it is for youngsters to access cross-sex hormones even without needing to see a doctor, we will think that simply not affirming them and gender-affirming care bans will sufficiently solve the multifaceted, Hydra-like harms of gender ideology, but this belief is sorely misguided. Firstly, the Cass review has shown that social transition is a significant intervention which predisposes youngsters to medicalization. Secondly, and most importantly, social transition is harmful in and of itself, not only psychologically, but physically as well. Binding and tucking damage the breasts and genitals of children. This, of course, only makes them more desperate to have those body parts removed entirely. Though banning gender-affirming care for minors is a crucial first step, it isn't a solution, not by a long shot. It's merely a delay. We will still have a cohort of young people who've been indoctrinated, perhaps socially transitioned as minors or young adults, and they will medicalize the day they turn 18, when they are no more capable of consent than they were when they went to sleep on the night before. And now, they will be angry. They will come into the gender clinics even more stubborn, even more sure of themselves, because of how long their cross-sex identity and desire to transition has persisted. If we want to end this ideology, it is unacceptable to settle for kids medicalizing at 18. It is unethical to ever turn a healthy person into a lifelong medical patient, but especially so when they are young and cognitively immature, and when they are being lied to by their doctors and treated with protocols underpinned by absolutely no evidence that any of this is a good idea. And those 18-year-olds who were denied medicalization as minors will just become even more ardent trans activists because you have told them no. And then in a few years' time, we will be right back to where we started. We must account for this inevitability and take steps to start mitigating it by understanding how the psychosocial, physical, and medical harms of transition are inextricably intertwined, because after all, our bodies and minds do not exist separately from one another. This crisis is fueled by a phenomenon pushed largely by people whose normal distress is pathologized, medicalized, and institutionally, ideologically enshrined. Our mental health institutions were clearly ill-equipped to deal with the underlying mental health issues, both social media-induced and not, of this cohort. If we do not address this, and the indoctrination at every corner, the secret transitions in schools, and the groups that give kids breast binders, we will be unlikely to make more than a dent in dismantling gender ideology. In other words, we are in for a long fight ahead. My commitment to my transition was stubborn, and it lasted for half of my life, despite my parents' non-affirmation. It took war and terror. It took witnessing horrors beyond my comprehension to realize that there is a hell on earth worse than any gender dysphoria. We must understand that what started as a rogue medical experiment confined to a few European hospitals nearly a century ago has morphed into a widespread ideological assault on reality, which has invaded every institution within Western society and has thoroughly pervaded youth culture. We are beyond the point where legislation alone is capable of neutralizing the threat of this ideology to our young people. If these kids are anything like me, they will need to be de-radicalized, and they will need proper mental health care and guidance. If we truly wish to end the death grip of gender ideology on our society, as a start, we need to face the distress that these kids are facing in an aggressively honest, compassionate, and practical way. Thank you.
Thank goodness for you, Maya. You are a passionate voice. Thank you for being here, telling your story. Our next speaker is Erin Friday. Erin is an attorney from California. She is the USA president of the parent advocacy group, Our Duty, an international support network for parents who wish to protect their children from gender ideology. Erin is the board of director for GenSpect and the mother of a formerly trans-identified child. Erin, thank you for being here today.
Good afternoon. I am so honored to be here today to talk about the pernicious and dangerous gender ideology. It is unquestionable that it is one of the most important issues of our lifetime. If one can be convinced that immutable males and females do not exist, one can be convinced just about anything. My story is a cautionary tale that is far from unique. I hear my story repeated countless times by other parents, with only the names being different and sadly the outcomes. I live in California. We had a perfect little family, one boy and one girl, a mere 20 months apart. Family came first as I balanced work life to ensure that I was the mom driving on all the class trips. I knew all of the teachers. I volunteered in the school as much as I could. I was trusting. I did not notice that the changes were happening to our curriculum. My daughter in 7th grade in her sex ed class had 1 hour completely devoted to gender ideology. There were cute cartoons. There were pictures that instructed her that she could have a female body and a male brain, and that the doctor just guessed about her sex. She was presented with a litany of gender identities that included nonsensical terms such as non-binary, demi-boy, and age-inappropriate terms such as polyamorous and pansexual. She was 11. It was not hip to be a white middle-class girl with 2 parents and a stable home, so she and all of her friends chose something on the LGBTQ alphabet. None of them wanted to be a straight girl. Half of her Scout troop came out as transgender. The social contagion was infused into her veins by the school and later cultivated by the internet. So the seeds were planted in my daughter, and they germinated when she hit puberty and her body started to change. She was introduced to pornography through friends and social media and the artsy community. Having loathed and avoided social media myself, I was clueless that my parental blocks were worthless. She had set up hidden accounts, and there were adults preying upon her. My daughter was into anime with its highly sexualized and gender-bending characters. Anime leads to hentai. Hentai is pornographic cartoons with stories of pedophilia, bestiality, BDSM, incest, and rape. Perhaps wanting to flee from being like the defiled women that she saw, at age 13, she announced that she was really a boy. This was months after spending days living online as the pandemic shut her out of any real social connections. The fantastical world of the internet was her life, where other youths shared their newly formed gender identities, urging others to do the same. They convinced each other that all of their sorrows, distress, loneliness would disappear if they just changed their bodies. Her high school perpetuated the myth that she was a boy. Because she was in school online, I could hear the school using a male name and pronouns for her. I called the school. I was apoplectic. The school told me that they were legally required to accept her gender identity. But they could not cite the law because there is no such law. The school told me that it had to be a safe space for her. I asked them, define safe for me. They couldn't. I asked them what color hair my daughter had. Was she fat, skinny, tall? Favorite ice cream? Tell me something you know about her. Because you see, they had never met her. She had never stepped foot into that school. It was the pandemic. But these complete strangers knew what was in my child's best interest. So the school sent Child Protective Services to my home, followed by the police under the ruse that my daughter was suicidal. But really, it was because I had challenged them. No investigation was opened, luckily, because I'm an attorney. Most parents are not as fortunate as I. With the announcement of the transgender identity, my daughter's mental health plummeted. She barely got out of bed. She stopped eating, stopped brushing her teeth. She was hardly living. Was it because her parents would not accept her as a boy? No. It was because a trans-identified child believes that every part of her body is wrong. Her voice, her movements, her genitals, her shoulders, her hips, everything. Adopting a trans identity is the epitome of self-loathing. Adding to the despair is that her school, friends, and the internet mafia told her that her parents must not love her if we did not accept her as a boy. Third, she was informed that she was destined to die young of suicide, as the majority of trans-identified kids kill themselves according to the gender ideologues. So try for a minute to imagine the angst, the pain, the despair my child was feeling, believing that her entire self was wrong. Her parents hated her, and she would die young. This is how every trans-identified child feels, even if their parents affirm their identity. Because those parents who are affirming are just affirming that their children are wrong and can only be fixed by a life of drugs and surgeries. The cruelty of this movement is incomprehensible. I tried to engage mental health providers to help my daughter, but they would only tell me that she would kill herself if I did not affirm her delusion. I finally found a provider who was willing to explore the root cause of her pain. He was helpful, but ultimately it is the parent's burden to save the child. I pulled her from public school, sent her to Catholic school, but the priest and teachers affirmed her false identity there too. I pulled the internet from her. I blocked the bad influences. In return, she told me how much she hated me. I swallowed it up as best as I could. I would have given up my relationship with her in exchange for her not medicalizing her body with irreversible, experimental, and harmful hormones and surgeries. She ultimately stopped believing that she was a boy, but she's not completely free of the ideology. The Obama and Biden administration and the transgender Borg promotes transgenderism in every milieu. Flags, constant celebrations, TikTok, TV shows, movies, it's ubiquitous. Thankfully, I currently have a strong and loving relationship with my daughter, and hopefully as she matures, she will understand what the transgender movement is really all about. It is not a civil rights movement. It's not about kindness and acceptance. It is not progressive, but is regressive, labeling boys who like pink as transgender, or girls who like stereotypical masculine activities as male. Transgenderism is tyrannical. It is designed to destroy families, vulnerable children, and women. Lenin said, "Give me one generation of your children, and I'll transform the whole world." The transgender movement has taken a generation of our children. My daughter was ensnared in the net in 2019, and the social contagion continues to grow, moving across the globe with lightning speed. Gallup recently reported that 1 in 4 Generation Xers, or Generation Z, sorry, Generation Zs claim to be LGBTQ. 1 in 4. In California, there is a 3-fold increase in kids adopting a trans identity. There is a 13-fold increase in girls ages 12 to 17 getting their healthy breasts removed. The pathway to indoctrination of the generation is the schools. Gender Spectrum, one of the U.S.'s most substantial purveyors of gender identities, partners with surgeons, gender doctors, and schools. And it revealed how it intended to get Lenin's generation of children. It advised to get, and I quote, gender ideology in every classroom, and to put, and I quote, policies that solidify gender identity as a permanent fixture in schools. Gender identity is a multi-headed hydra that must be defeated for the sake of our children and grandchildren, and of course for women, since we are being erased as men pretend to be women take us over. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. Our next speaker is Stefano Gennarini. He's the Vice President for Legal Studies at the Center for Family and Human Rights. He represents CFAM at the UN and researches and writes on international law and policy. He advises UN delegations and liaises with pro-family organizations around the world. Stefano.
Thank you. I've been asked to speak about gender ideology and parental rights in the context of international law and policy, and I apologize for reading my remarks, but I'm not as disciplined as Jay, so it would take a long time. I must note as a preliminary matter that states have no obligations with regards to gender identity under international law. There is no right to self-identify. And the current rapporteur on violence against women, Reem Al-Salim, has said as much in her report's interventions. States do have an obligation to register children at birth, including a right to an identity. And basic rules of legal interpretation tell us that this also includes the element of sex. The recent fad of parents declining to recognize the sex of their child is in violation of the obligation of states to respect a child's identity. Indeed, states have an obligation to protect children from gender ideology and the predators and profiteers who spread it. But I will not make that case now. Now we want to look at parental rights. It is helpful to begin with an anecdote to illustrate the problem at hand. I was at a UNICEF event with Catherine Russell, the director of UNICEF, last year, and I asked her if UNICEF, the UN Children's Agency, had a position on the issue of children gaining access to transgender-affirming drugs and surgeries. A spokesperson she put me in touch with, because she would not touch the issue, said UNICEF did not take any position on this. I was shocked. Affirming the rights and responsibilities of parents would seem like the easiest thing to do in this context. And yet, the world's leading children's agency did not want to take a position. What I want to suggest now is that international law requires respect for parental rights in the context of the fallout of gender ideology for children and families. And there are two relevant aspects of parental rights and responsibility in international law. One is the primary responsibility of parents for the development and well-being of their children, and the other is the prior right of parents to direct the education of their children. These are not only well-established, binding obligations, they are foundational principles of the human rights project post-World War II. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights recognizes and defines the family as the natural and the fundamental group unit of society, entitled to protection by society and the state. This elevated language is not just rhetoric, it is definitional. The pre-juridical importance of the family was stated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights deliberately as a check on the power of the state after the world observed the horrors inflicted on entire populations by totalitarian states. The right and responsibility of parents have also to be understood in this context. So, for example, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that parents have a prior right to educate their children in conformity with their convictions. This language was developed specifically to counter the possibility that state-run education systems be used once again to control entire populations and indoctrinate them, pitting children against parents and even denouncing them when they were not loyal to government-backed ideologies. This was common under the Nazi and communist regimes. Similarly, the Declaration on the Rights of the Child states that the responsibility for the well-being and development of the child lies first with parents. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child also recognizes the primary responsibility of parents. The sense in which these instruments use the term primary is not in relative or temporal terms, but in absolute terms, almost metaphysical, you could say. That is why international law also requires the state to provide the family with assistance and support in fulfilling its primary responsibility. These provisions are unambiguous. They are further expounded in the provisions of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, and other binding human rights instruments with regards to civil rights, education, social assistance, family reunification, religious and cultural rights. It goes on and on. Sadly, however, international aid agencies, UN agencies, treaty bodies, special procedures, all largely, if not entirely, ignore these provisions. In fact, they sometimes make the case that it is states who have the primary responsibility for the well-being and development of children and not parents. Even representatives of the European Union make this argument routinely in UN negotiations, that parents don't have the primary responsibility for the well-being of children, and that states do instead. The sad irony, of course, is that this is the same kind of children's policy you might have expected in Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. Even more troubling, UN agencies and human rights bodies increasingly seek to carve out a gray zone of sexual and gender autonomy for children, where parents are excluded or even sanctioned. This is sometimes done through extra attention and specific programming for adolescents, as well as labels in UN resolutions and international aid programs having to do with adolescent-friendly and youth-friendly or confidential. Just a few examples of where this leads. The UN Population Fund promotes access to contraception for 10-year-olds in school without parental consent. Indicators for the 2030 Agenda goals include whether or not countries require parental consent for access to sexual and reproductive health, meaning that if you do require parental consent, you can't meet the 2030 Agenda goals. UNICEF promoted a publication in recent years that said that pornography can be beneficial to teenagers experimenting with sexuality. And there are myriads of UN agency-backed comprehensive sexuality education publications that promote children's sexual autonomy. And they openly explain that comprehensive sexuality education programs will help create demand for sexual and reproductive health services among children and adolescents. This is bad enough. But when one looks at the context of digital technology, this gray zone, so-called gray zone of sexual autonomy for children, starts to look more like a groomer zone. The UN Cybercrime Treaty adopted last December by the General Assembly proposes legalizing sexting between consenting adolescents and between consenting adolescents and adults as well. The CRC committee, the committee that monitors the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, issued a General Comment 25, on children's rights in relation to the digital environment, and tries to limit the parents' ability to monitor and restrict children's access to digital spaces, by second-guessing parents, of course. Specifically to our topic today, it proposes that parents cannot limit the ability of their children to access counseling on sexuality and services like abortion and LGBT health services, including transgender services. The General Comment even suggests that parents should be forced into counseling or re-education of some sort when they try to limit their children's digital exposure, calling them a threat to the child's safety. Another General Comment of the same committee, Committee on the Rights of the Child, says that there should be no barriers to commodities, information, and counseling on sexual and reproductive health and rights, such as requirements for third-party consent or authorization. In addition, particular efforts need to be made to overcome barriers of stigma and fear experienced by, for example, adolescent girls, girls with disabilities, and lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and intersex adolescents in gaining access to such services. It should be noted that UNFPA, the lead sexual and reproductive health agency, defines transgender drugs and surgeries for adolescents as an integral part of sexual and reproductive health services. And that International Planned Parenthood Federation, the largest provider of sexual and reproductive health in the world, is also the leading provider of transgender-affirming care globally. This is all to say that we need to return to sanity and common sense. I hope that the current review of all USAID programs and all State Department programs and diplomacy will lead to a wider review of international programming broadly, of all international agencies, all multilateral spaces, and that this review may lead to mainstreaming parental rights into all programming involving children. In the long run, this will be essential to eradicate gender ideology for good and to protect children from new and emerging threats. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano. We have some time for Q&A, and I'm going to turn over the first question to my colleague Grace Melton, who is the UN representative for the Heritage Foundation, one of our co-sponsors. Grace.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you all for your remarks this afternoon. I was wondering, since we're here at the UN, if some of you could speak to what the World Health Organization in particular is doing in its promotion of gender affirmative care, and what you'd recommend that delegates here at the UN do to respond to that.
Should we take this mic off?
Can we take it off?
Yeah, it comes off.
So I'll just stand out here because you can't see me otherwise. My understanding is that the World Health Organization is working on a guideline on transgender affirming care, following controversy regarding the provision of transgender affirming care, so-called, to children. The World Health Organization has made a declaration in like a press statement that this guidance for gender affirming care will not be for children. But as Maya was saying earlier, that's not a solution. That's not acceptable. The problem is giving children the illusion and the false hope from an early age that gender transition, so-called, can actually happen.
Okay. Questions?
Hi, I'm Anne Belanger. I'm the Director of Fertility Business Initiatives. It's a U.S. nonprofit here in Delaware. My question is for Maya, but I want to preface it with the comment on what is universally now being used with comprehensive sexuality education, and it's being promoted and pushed everywhere. And I understand it's being called sexual rights and so on. What I do with the Billings ovulation method in my nonprofit is comprehensive fertility education. And I really see that through Womb International's efforts as an answer for our educational and our health institutions, because it's very delicate to speak about sexuality from parents to children. And it often gets overlooked. Many parents don't feel comfortable talking about it. And understandably, because children develop at different rates. But we all recognize that there needs to be some kind of information that is delivered to children that's age appropriate so they understand their sexualities and they are able to grow in them. They have both male and female sexual content is available, and we have that in our studies and in our programs. So I'm looking at how can I bring that forward to the educational department and the health department, particularly here in the US, because I am a US-based nonprofit, to work with the US in providing that information, which is much more complementary to children. And my question for Maya was having to do with the LGBTQ community. Because that community, going back 40 years, it was including transgenderism, changing your sex from one to the other. But now, in the last 20 years, the transgender movement has its own community. It has its own flag. It has its own identity. I'm wondering, Maya, when you as a young person decided to move in that direction, did you find camaraderie and welcoming support? Was the community, it paints itself as universally accepting of everyone? Or did you actually feel like they loved you in that community? Or is that sort of a shadow over what the rest of us hear about? So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So these LGBTQ plus whatever, the whole Wi-Fi code that it's become, the community is really quite a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, they're very quick to welcome you in, and what I find happening a lot is actually that you have like gay and lesbian youth coming to these LGBTQ plus youth centers, and they want to find friends, potential romantic interests, and they end up getting sucker punched into the trans cult immediately. I saw this in Israel as well, actually, where, especially young Palestinians who came from really, extremely repressive environments. When their parents found out they were gay, there were honor-killing attempts, and so they would flee to Israel and find themselves in an LGBTQ youth organization. And one of the first questions they were asked about was about their preferred pronouns. So these communities are really a double-edged sword. It's pretty extreme. This manifests in a pretty extreme way in more repressive countries, but in the United States, which is, of course, where I grew up, there is, the communities, they seem to be pretty, internally cohesive once you're in them. But of course, if you declare a trans identity and then you realize that the entire thing makes no sense and that it's a lie, then the same people who used to be your friends will start doxing you. They will threaten you. I get death threats on a daily basis. They will try to, discredit you. All of the friendships that you thought you had built are actually not based on any kind of, human to human valuing of one another, but are actually entirely based on holding the same set of extreme neo-Marxist, postmodern political beliefs. And the love is really only about as deep as the ideology is. And once you divest yourself from ideological beliefs, all those people will abandon you. And it's really quite unfortunate, but that just is how it is.
Yes. Hi. I'm I'm Maris, journalist from Estonia, and from your remarks, I heard like a couple of times that it's a global effort. The protection for the family is a global effort. So I'm wondering, from an international perspective, who are U.S. allies in here? Like, where do you look for inspiration? Anyone?
So you mean allies in terms of other countries?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
is it like do you have like international?
Let's talk about Estonia. I don't know, actually. Yeah, the reality is there's a reason that it's UN agencies that are pushing this stuff, because the truth of the matter is, the General Assembly, the vast majority of the countries of the world don't want this, right? And so it's effectively Western countries. Until recently, actually, the United States itself, but of course in Europe, it's the European Union, various agencies of the UN that are pushing this stuff. And frankly, it's essentially what Pope Francis calls ideological colonization. It's so obvious, right? If you're Tanzanian and someone's trying to condition medical aid on some kind of sex education, that's essentially sort of indoctrination in this ideology. But there hasn't been a sort of international coalition to fight it. That's the difficulty. It's easy in the United States, or relatively easy, because we have this kind of structures of civil society and NGOs. We call them nonprofits. And so it's sort of a natural way to do this. And then we've got this federated system where you have 50 different states that are their own sort of semi-sovereigns. My sense is that the effort internationally, at least to push back, is just getting started. We benefit from the fact that the UN structure, for something to be hard law, I'd have to pass a majority of the countries. It's not going to happen anytime soon. But it doesn't mean that you can't ultimately get soft law through these agencies, which is what we've been dealing with, and that's Stefano's jurisdiction.
Yeah, I would just add that in terms of government support, there's quite a lot of hunger, and the delegates in the room will tell you, especially the delegates from the Global South will tell you, there's a lot of hunger for pro-life, pro-family initiatives, and they're very well accepted by countries. The biggest obstacle to that is the European Union and the EU bureaucracy, because they are so invested in the gender ideology, even more than the U.S. State Department was under the Biden administration. So you know, the U.S. government, they flip-flop depending on whether there's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. But the EU Commission, the EU bureaucracy, they're always promoting gender ideology, and they're creating regional agreements, cross-regional agreements, to get governments to sort of soften their position on these issues. In terms of the support for pro-life, pro-family values, I think a great initiative of the Trump administration in his first term was the Geneva Consensus Declaration, which is now is it upward of 40 countries? 39 countries. We're going to get to over 40. I think the Geneva Consensus Declaration, if the Trump administration and U.S. diplomats work diligently together, by the end of his second term, we could be talking about up to 90 countries that are signatories of the Geneva Consensus Declaration. And the biggest obstacle to that, again, is the European Union.
Can I just have a follow-up, just really quickly? But do you see trends shifting in EU already?
In EU.
Is there some hope for you guys?
The hope is that the politicians in Europe develop the courage and conviction to break EU social policy, especially in the diplomatic sphere. We haven't seen that yet.
And I'll say something, I want to say this because it's sort of an awkward point, but there are lots of different countries with different cultures in the EU. And so my impression is that Central and Eastern European countries would generally like to resist more of this than they do. Americans, we tend to just fixate on Western European countries because I guess they're closer, right? And my sense is that the stomach in the fight is actually in Central and Eastern Europe. But if they're, countries a member of the EU, there's only so much you can do.
I have several questions back here,
Okay.
Lisa.
Sure.
Hello, thank you for your presentations. I am a mother of 2 children under the age of 3, and I'm really afraid of the environment they will grow up in. So I would like to ask you, both from the perspective of the daughter and the parents, what can we do to protect our children?
Okay. So first and foremost, you're already protecting your child because you know that the ideology is out there. I was clueless. I had no idea what was around the corner. I really promote that parents do not send their kids to public school because public school is the incubator for this, and it's really hard to find teachers who are safe. So if you can homeschool your children, I would recommend that. If you're not able to do that, I would send them to a Catholic school, even though my Catholic school failed me. It was better than the public school. And it's really important for you to indoctrinate your child first. And I mean that in a good way. You tell your children over and over and over again that you are a boy or you are a girl, or whatever sex they are, and you fill their heads with that, and you tell them that if a teacher or any adult tells them otherwise, that they are to tell mommy. Like, this is really important for you to be in the know all the time. If you send your child to a school, you walk that school, you see what teachers have, what flags wear, you look at every book on the bookshelf. That's going to tell you if those teachers are good or bad. Don't give them the iPhone. There's alternatives. Your kid may feel like, they're the only one. Join with your child's friends. Join together and say, we're going to give a flip phone. But the internet, you cannot stop this from coming in. You cannot put on parental blockage anywhere. They read porn to kids on YouTube now. And they invite them to take on transgender identities. So you have to be vigilant. And you, again, indoctrinate your children first. Tell them what is coming down the pike for them. Thank you.
Yeah, Erin's advice is objectively good advice. I'll add some of my own. It depends on the age of the child. Every single child, the way that gender ideology has been injected into all kinds of school curricula is really aimed at, capturing the minds of children at very specific developmental levels. So a kid, barring no developmental delays, most kids only understand that sex is 1, biological and 2, immutable by about, somewhere between the ages of 5 and 7. And this really coincides with the beginning of the development of their higher order reasoning skills. So before then, if you give a 4-year-old a Ken doll and you put a dress on him and you ask the 4-year-old, is Ken a boy or a girl? The 4-year-old is going to say that Ken is a girl because he's wearing a dress. But if you ask the same question to a 6 or a 7-year-old who doesn't have any developmental delays, that 6 or 7-year-old will say, no, Ken is a boy, but he's wearing a dress. So there's a reason why they want to get to the kids really young. And it's because, all human beings, we're all born with the inborn ability to distinguish males from females. If this is something that parents had to teach their kids, clearly a lot of parents would neglect to teach this to their kids, and then our species would not continue to survive. So clearly, we have these inbuilt reasoning skills, and if a 6, 7, or 8-year-old does not in fact understand that biological sex is immutable, it means one of 2 things. One, either they have some kind of organic developmental delay, perhaps autism spectrum condition or something of that nature, or they've had a developmental delay induced by their education. And now parents have no way of knowing where the developmental delay is coming from, because half of the parents believe that that this entire ideology is based on some kind of reality, and the other half are just unaware that any of this is going on. And so for young kids, what's really important is obviously understanding that until a certain age, they don't even understand that sex, if they're born a boy, they'll grow up to be a man, or vice versa for girls and women. So it's important for young kids to understand that, you're a boy or a girl based on the body parts you have, not based on the length of your hair or the toys you like to play with. Or your favorite color. It's based only on the body parts that you have, and that that doesn't have to define very much about your life. You can be millions of different ways as a boy or a girl, but you can never become the opposite. So that's important for very young kids. And then for slightly older kids, when it comes to puberty, I would say that a lot of parents these days know that it's important to explain to a child who they see as on the cusp of puberty, explaining to them the changes that their bodies will experience, and the physical changes, and perhaps some scientific explanations as to what's going on to catalyze those changes. However, I think that not enough parents discuss with their children how hellish puberty actually is, from a psychosocial standpoint. And so, in my case, my parents did a great job of explaining to me the science behind it. And I was an 8-year-old who was obsessed with rare brain tumors, so I was quite satisfied with that explanation. But unfortunately, I was also, an 8-year-old who didn't know how to relate to her peers because she was obsessed with rare brain tumors. So I didn't know anything about emotions. And so when I started to experience a lot of weird emotions during puberty, including an extreme disdain at the fact that, my body was changing, and the fact that, at puberty, girls' friend groups the social rules become increasingly more complex. So obviously I felt even more alienated from my peers. And again, no one told me that this was normal, because no one thought that they would need to tell me that experiencing high levels of distress or negative emotions during puberty, especially for girls, is normal. So they need to understand the emotional shifts in addition to, the biochemical and physical shifts. And then if you have a young adult kid who has gotten snatched by this ideology, the important thing to do is really to not settle for them making whatever decisions they want at 18. Because 18-year-olds, from my personal experience as being a former 18-year-old, are really dumb, okay? 18-year-olds are really dumb. So they're extremely impulsive, they're cognitively underdeveloped. These particular 18-year-olds have high rates of autism and ADHD, which make them even less emotionally developed than other 18-year-olds. So this is a really abysmal state to put this type of decision upon an 18-year-old of okay, are you going to want to have kids? And, just the entire, there's no evidence underpinning for any of it. It's all pseudoscientific. So the point is, if you have a young adult child, I would say absolutely hold the line, do whatever you can in your power to prevent them from making any kinds of permanent decisions until they're older and totally financially independent. That's kind of my, sorry for the rant, but that's my advice.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Right here in the front. We're going to go right here in the front. Okay. Stefano said we're going to go right here in the front.
Is there any? Go up and ask him later.
Thank you very much. I'm glad I've attended this session, especially for those of us from Africa. You find that I went to Beijing 30 years ago, and after Beijing, many of us formed non-profit organizations. And as at that time, there was nothing to talk about what do you call it, LGTB or whatever. But later now, in later years, you find that the UN, the USAID, and all of them would want to be sure that your policy, that you endorse such policies before they give you grant or aids. And many people were running away from that. They want to read your policies and so on. So it is good to hear what is going on here. It is great, and it will be a good news for all mainly the African countries. Thank you very much.
We good? Okay. All right. Well, that's it for today. I'm sorry. But I do want to, on behalf of the Heritage Foundation and CFAM, just express our appreciation one more time to the U.S. Mission and to you, Maya, Aaron. Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you to all of you for attending.
Let's give these guys a round of applause, please. They did a great job. And then our presenters, please don't leave yet. We want to get your picture by the signs, please. Thank you so much for attending our two-day conference of CSWF, the Conference on the State of Women and Families. We're so grateful for the opportunity